First You Think is a not-for-profit ministry of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. Support us at ucdsm.org today.
Our theme for October is fear. We have certain brain circuitry that gives us quick, intuitive reactivity, and another system that's thoughtful and analytic, but slower. Next month, our theme will be reason. The thing is, reason is slow. Thinking things through is going to take a minute. Fear latches onto our intuitive hunches and generates a quicker response. And our ancestors often needed that. Fear helps us survive by grabbing our attention when there's something to which we need to be attentive, and by gearing up energy to protect ourselves. So our brains are built with this dual control system, the slow and thoughtful and the quick and intuitive. The dual control system was pretty adaptive for hunter-gatherers who never traveled very far. If there was a vivid memory of a danger ready to hand, then it was probably a memory of something that actually happened in your presence and not far from where you are right now. If you're facing a situation that looks similar, it makes sense for that fear reaction to be triggered without waiting for the slow, plodding assessment of reasoning. Imagine a Stone Age hunter who falls asleep by the glowing embers of a campfire one night, and when he opens his eyes in the morning, he is lying on the sidewalk at the corner of 8th Street and Grand Avenue, downtown Des Moines. That's basically us. We inherited our protective and fearful reactivity from Stone Age ancestors, only we're trying to make our way in a very different world. That reactivity was really helpful for our ancestors dealing with the world they found themselves in millions of years ago, but a system that grabs our attention, gives us quick reaction, intuitive judgments, overrides reason, is ripe for manipulation. And so the evening news specializes in a report you can't afford to miss about a danger that could be lurking near you. It grabs attention. And that's what they need for their ratings. The result is that the overall fear in our lives creeps upward. We overestimate the risk from things that make the evening news and underestimate the risk from things that don't. Murder, terrorism, fire, flood, and sharks seize our fearful imaginations. But risks like diabetes and asthma and heart disease and auto accidents are much greater but get less of our attention. Now, we need to have that fear response. The thing is, though, that the fear response is often not very bright. The fear response can't even tell the difference between your firsthand experience and someone else's stories. It believes the examples that are most readily at hand. Statistics and rational risk analysis have no effect on the fear response. Fear will fixate on one lurid story. And that was fine for our hunter-gatherer ancestors who never traveled very far. For our ancestors, any vivid memory of danger ready to hand probably was a memory that actually happened in their presence. In a situation that looked similar to that memory, the warning bells of fear made sense. We see fear controlling how people vote and hence what policies are adopted. Consider immigration. Suppose the flow of immigration into this country were to drastically drop. Let's say that somehow conditions in their home countries improved enough so that would-be immigrants were content to stay home. I understand there's some evidence for an argument that local communities would, in some ways, face less pressure on healthcare, education, and housing needs in the U.S. On the other hand, in other ways, there'd be increased pressure on Social Security and healthcare systems as our aging U.S. population would be less offset by typically younger immigrants. Some industries, notably agriculture and construction, would face labor shortages affecting production costs. Reduced immigration would likely lead to decreased consumer spending, reduced economic activity, lower GDP growth. And we would lose diversity and the creativity and innovation that is engendered when diverse cultural perspectives interact. It's a complicated issue. that really needs the reason system to come online and think it through. Instead, fear of the other hijacks any rational or evidence-based approach. You might remember that last January, when our theme was pluralism, I mentioned the work of Australian political scientist Karen Stenner, who argues that underlying racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, xenophobia, transphobia is something more fundamental: differenceism. The various forms of harmful prejudice are all variations of a basic anxiety about difference, an anxiety that produces, in Stenner's words, a fundamental and overwhelming desire to establish and defend some collective order of oneness and sameness. In one of Stenner's studies, people scoring high on fear of difference were told that NASA had verified the existence of alien life, beings very different from us in ways we are not yet even able to imagine. After being told that, the measured racial intolerance of those subjects decreased by half. In other words, they are afraid of whatever is most different. For fearful white people, as Stenner put it, black people look a lot more like us than them when there are green people afoot. Fear not only shuts down reason, it shuts down compassion. It closes our head and it closes our heart. My colleague Erica Hewitt wrote movingly, she says, "For many reasons, people depart. They leave home or the places given to them in place of home that might have been lost to war. They seek refuge from 1,000 dangers and uncertainties. For many reasons, many of them inconceivable to us who live in relative peace and prosperity, people can't stay where they are, in the places they know. So for themselves and for their children, they trade the hell they know for the unknown and the foreign. For so many reasons, unimaginable to me and maybe to you too, people give up their sense of belonging. They surrender the climate and food and sounds and smells that their bodies have always known for the new, the unfamiliar, the harsh, and the unlearnable. Some members of our human family are throwing their arms wide to welcome those seeking mercy and seeking home. Others are nearly taking up arms to drive them away. Those of us who call ourselves Americans are all, to some degree, complicit in the unstable geopolitical disasters that result in such vast human suffering. Our country's own policies are culpable, and by extension, us. We have protected our American lifestyle of consumption and corporate rule, and we've lost a little bit of our soul. That's what fear does. Fear is a voice that says nothing matters more than self-preservation and self-importance. Fear drains the antifreeze out of your heart, so your compassion center runs cold. It cuts off the feeding tubes that keep our souls supple and our morality intact. How much would it cost us to invoke the principles of our faith and the beating heart of our ethical lives by saying, we're a single, interconnected human family. We make one another stronger and braver by sharing what we have. All people have the same worth and the same inherent dignity, and no human being is illegal. The suffering of people beyond our borders asks us to examine how we've created the conditions for that suffering." End quote. Another issue where our fear reaction overrode both rationality and compassion is our incarceration rate. In 1930, about 200 of every 100,000 men was incarcerated, and it stayed relatively flat for the next 40 years. Indeed, as of 1970, there were fewer than 200 of every 100,000 men incarcerated. By 1980, it had climbed a bit, up to 275 men per 100,000, and then it really took off. By 1990, we had jumped all the way to almost 600 per 100,000. By 2000, we were over 900 men per 100,000 in state or federal prison. It's dropped a little bit since then, but still stands about triple what it was in 1980. Women's incarceration has also increased, albeit less dramatically. The United States has 4.4% of the world's population, yet we have 22% of all the world's prisoners. And we're paying about $84 billion a year for all those prisons and jails. Adding in the people on probation and on parole, and about 1 in 32 Americans are under some form of criminal justice system control. I will pick up from there after our interlude. Bruce, maybe some chain gang music? The drastic uptick in incarceration was driven by both greater likelihood of a prison sentence and longer sentence terms. And those, in turn, were driven by many states passing 3 strikes laws and mandatory sentencing. The war on drugs is a big part of this picture. Americans got scared. We were scared of drug addicts, and whites were scared of African Americans, who are way disproportionately incarcerated. As blacks were freed from the most onerous shackles of Jim Crow segregation, white voters elected officials to find ways to move mass numbers of blacks into prison instead. We're scared, whether we have any basis for it or not. Gallup polling since 1989 has found that in most years in which there was a decline in the U.S. crime rate, a majority of Americans said violent crime was getting worse, which is just what is going on right now. Researchers suggest that changes in our news media contributed to growing fear and misperception. Media consolidation reduced competition. Media executives slashed budgets for investigative journalism. It was cheaper to fill the space from the police blotter. It's safer, easier, and cheaper to write about crimes committed by poor people than those committed by the wealthy, who might be funding the advertising revenue. Stories about a missing white woman are cheap to produce, and they grab audience share. Stay tuned for unfolding developments. Fear grows, reactivity grows. We become, as a people, less rational and less compassionate. The reality is that we in the developed world are safer than any human population ever has been. Try spending an afternoon in a Victorian cemetery, noticing how many of the gravestones have death dates only a few years different from the birth dates. The defining feeling of our age ought to be gratitude, not fear. And yet it seems the less we have to fear, the more we fear. The numbers show decreasing crime, decreasing disease, increasing lifespan. However, shaped in a world of campfires and flint spears, our intuition is as innately lousy with numbers as it is good with stories. And don't think that people on the right have a monopoly on fear. The left has a history of its own unfounded fears. In 1967, a bestseller by William and Paul Paddock was titled Famine 1975. It was full of detailed scientific data and reasoning. Population was booming, agriculture was static. There were going to be massive famines in about 8 more years, said the Paddocks. And the very next year, 1968, Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb similarly predicted huge die-offs from outstripping our food supply. 65 million Americans will die of starvation between 1980 and 1989, Ehrlich predicted. And by 1999, the U.S. population will have declined to 22.6 million. In 1970, Harvard biologist George Wald predicted that civilization will end within 15 or 30 years unless immediate action is taken against problems facing humanity. Also in 1970, Life magazine reported that by 1985, air pollution will have reduced the amount of sunlight reaching Earth by 1/2. So, what are we to do? Aware that fear gets attention, that fear can dominate lives, that fear also leads us to bad decisions. How do we deal with it? How do we hew to the path of both reason and compassion? We must begin with ourselves. It's easy to point the finger at other people getting carried away by self-centered or irrational fears. But as your spiritual leader, I must remind you of the spiritual task, which is always to turn that finger back to point to ourselves. All of us are prone to fear, and all of us can grow more skillful at dealing with it. The primary task is to notice. I ask you this month to take up the spiritual exercise that is in our October Connecting packet. Every day for 7 days, write in your journal describing one fear you experienced in the previous 24 hours. If you don't have a journal, you might think about getting one. There are a number of journaling practices that are tremendously useful, even necessary for our ethical and spiritual growth, which, after all, is the mission of this congregation. Or for this exercise, just use whatever paper you have around. Every day for a week, handwrite a description of one fear you experienced in the previous 24 hours and answer these questions about it. What were you afraid of? How strong was it on a scale of mild to terrifying? How long did it last, or is it ongoing? Would you say there was a rational basis for that fear? And what came of it? What did the fear bring about? What response did you make to the fear? At the end of the week, look back over your entries. What lessons do you draw? For me, as I was sharing with the Connection Circles facilitators yesterday, I started this on Friday before last, and that first day I had a very definite fear. I thought I might run out of gas. As I started for work that morning, a little meter on my dash said I had 40 miles left. But when I started home that evening, the meter for miles left just had a dash. Oops. Describing in my journal, I recalled that every traffic light that stopped me from rolling on through that intersection brought up tension and exasperation and impatience, and I also recalled noticing these reactions and how noticing them helped relax them. I noticed, as the reading Louise shared earlier said, that I was all right now, reminding myself that if I do run out of gas, I know what to do. There's an empty gas container in the trunk, and I'll walk to a filling station and fill it and bring it back. It'll take a while, and it'll be inconvenient, but just knowing that I knew how to handle it calmed me. Nothing terrible is threatening. And even if it were, there is a crucial touchstone that I come back to over and over. We all die. Take reasonable precautions and leave it in the universe's hands. The next day was Saturday, my sermon writing day. I was putting together the sermon you may have heard last week on repentance and repair. I had read the book, but choosing how to frame the common read and what small sliver of the book to highlight was the labor of the day. And when I came to my journal and asked of myself, what did I fear that day? It brought to mind that there is always a low-level fear or anxiety about creative work on deadline. Even after all these years, when long experience has taught me that I will be able to pull something together, I do worry. Will it be very good? Will it be persuasive or moving or helpful? In this case, that little bit of fear in the background is a friend. It helps keep me focused on the task. Every day, there's some form of fear, small or large, that bubbles up. This journaling exercise helped me be more aware of the little ways that it pops up, sometimes helpfully, sometimes not. The primary task is to notice. So give that spiritual exercise a try yourself. Listen attentively to what fear says. Don't tell the fear to go away. Don't repress or suppress. And don't indulge either. Let fear go, not in the sense of dismissing it or even releasing it, but let it go in the sense of allow it to go on. Allow it to proceed and watch as it does. If fear feels listened to, then fear will begin calming down. It may take a little while. Give it all the time it needs. It's when we don't acknowledge our fears that they keep on in the background, pulling our levers. You can then choose to call on other inner voices that you have. You can say, okay, let me now hear from compassion, from that capacity within me to love my neighbor, love all beings. What does my voice of universal love have to say? Listen to the voice of fear, and when it has been heard, come back to the voice of love. Amen.